The streets of Sarajevo had been decorated for days. Banners in the imperial yellow of the Austro-Hungarian Empire hung from the shop fronts along the Appel quay. Municipal workers had swept the cobblestones. Local officials had rehearsed their welcomes. The city, a small, sun-warmed Balkan capital pressed between the Miljacka River and the hills above it, was preparing, with the particular nervous energy of a provincial town receiving royalty, for the arrival of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to one of the oldest thrones in the world. It was the 28th of June, 1914, a Sunday. The weather was warm and clear. By the end of the afternoon, Franz Ferdinand would be dead, his wife dying in the seat beside him, and a 37-year-old world order would have begun its final collapse. Not in a single dramatic rupture, but in the slow, inexorable way that a bridge fails, quietly, structurally, invisibly, and then all at once. To understand what happened that Sunday in Sarajevo, not merely the shots, but the catastrophe those shots released, you have to first understand the world that existed before them. Because the assassination of Franz Ferdinand did not cause the First World War in the way that a fire causes a burning building, what it did was something more precise and more terrifying. It revealed that the building had been soaked in gasoline for decades, that the men responsible for its maintenance had been quietly, and with the best of intentions, making it more flammable every year. That what looked from the outside like the most stable and prosperous civilization in human history was, in the very machinery of its stability, carrying the mechanism of its own destruction. Civilizations rarely perceive their own fragility. That is among their defining characteristics. The Europe of 1914 was, by almost any measure its inhabitants could apply, a triumph. In the preceding 100 years, the continent had not experienced a major war between its great powers, Britain, France, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia, since the defeat of Napoleon in 1815. A century of relative peace had produced an explosion of wealth, technology, and cultural confidence that seemed, to those living inside it, like the natural condition of an advanced society rather than an extraordinary historical exception. European cities were connected by railways and telegraph lines. European merchants traded across borders with a freedom that would not be seen again for most of the 20th century. European intellectuals largely believed that the dense web of economic interdependence binding the great powers together had made large-scale war not merely undesirable, but essentially irrational, a relic of a barbarism they had left behind. They were right that war was irrational. They had not yet learned that human institutions do not require rationality to function, only momentum. Beneath this gleaming surface, forces had been gathering for years that the men managing Europe's affairs had chosen, for reasons of pride, fear, and bureaucratic inertia, not to resolve. Rivalries between empires, nationalist movements straining against old borders, and above all, a system of military alliances so tightly interlocked that a conflict between any two nations could, by the logic of the agreements already signed and the mobilization timetables already drawn, pull every major power in Europe into the same war within a matter of weeks. This was the world Franz Ferdinand was traveling through on the morning of June 28th. It was a world that had convinced itself it was stable. It was a world that was, in fact, waiting. To understand the alliances, you have to go back a generation, to a man who built them and who understood, better than almost anyone who came after him, exactly how dangerous they could become. Otto von Bismarck had unified Germany in 1871 through a series of calculated wars, and in doing so had created the most powerful land army on the European continent and a nation-state that the other great powers found simultaneously indispensable and alarming. Before Bismarck, Germany had been a loose collection of kingdoms, principalities, and city-states, a geographic expression more than a coherent nation. After Bismarck, it was the dominant land power in Europe, a unified industrial giant of 65 million people sitting at the center of the continent. France, which had been defeated in the war that completed this unification, had lost the wealthy industrial provinces of Alsace and Lorraine and had not forgotten it. Bismarck's genius, and it was a genuine genius, whatever its moral costs, lay in recognizing that a newly powerful Germany needed above all else to avoid a war on two fronts simultaneously. A Germany fighting Russia in the east and France in the west at the same time would be destroyed. His entire diplomatic career after 1871 was devoted to preventing that outcome through a web of treaties, assurances, and carefully managed relationships designed to keep Europe's powers apart and Germany safely at the center. He was, in other words, a man who understood the machine he had built and kept his hand firmly on its controls. When Kaiser Wilhelm II forced Bismarck from power in 1890, he inherited that machine without inheriting the understanding that ran it. Wilhelm was 29 years old, erratic, insecure, possessed of great intelligence and almost no wisdom, and deeply convinced that Germany's destiny demanded a larger stage than Bismarck's cautious diplomacy had allowed. He was the grandson of Queen Victoria of Britain and the cousin of Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, and he spent much of his reign conducting foreign policy as though it were a family argument rather than the management of a continent's balance of power. He let Bismarck's carefully maintained treaty with Russia quietly lapse. He pursued a naval buildup that alarmed Britain. He spoke loudly and often of Germany's rightful place in the world, without appearing to consider what that language sounded like to the nations around him. Where Bismarck had arranged the pieces on the board to prevent encirclement, Wilhelm managed, within 2 decades, to achieve it. France and Russia formed an alliance in 1894, driven by the straightforward logic that two nations who feared the same neighbor had reason to stand together. Britain, alarmed by the rapid expansion of the German navy and the threat it posed to British mastery of the seas, aligned informally with France in 1904 and with Russia in 1907. By the time those agreements were in place, the Europe that Bismarck had spent his career carefully balancing had divided, with remarkable neatness, into 2 armed camps. On one side stood the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, bound by treaty to come to one another's defense if attacked. On the other stood the Triple Entente, France, Russia, and Britain, linked by a somewhat looser set of agreements that nevertheless carried the same essential logic. If you fought one, you would likely fight all. The theory behind these alliances was deterrence. If every nation knew that attacking one member of a bloc meant fighting all of them, then, the thinking went, no rational nation would attack. Peace through mutual terror. The concept was not absurd. It had a certain cold coherence. And for a while, through a series of crises in Morocco in 1905 and 1911, through the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913, it had appeared to hold. Diplomats had managed each crisis back from the edge. The system had been tested and had not broken. What no one fully reckoned with was the way the alliance system had changed the nature of a crisis itself. In an earlier era, a conflict between two nations was, at least potentially, a conflict between two nations. Diplomats had room to maneuver. Solutions could be found, compromises struck, face-saving formulas invented. But in the Europe of 1914, a serious conflict between any two great powers was almost automatically a conflict between all of them, because the moment one side began mobilizing its army, The vast, complex, slow-moving process of calling up reservists, loading trains, moving supplies. The other side had to begin mobilizing too, for fear of being caught unprepared. And once both sides began mobilizing, the logic of the timetables took over, because the plans the generals had written assumed that speed was everything, and that any delay in execution would be fatal. The machine, in other words, had been designed to move faster than the diplomats could talk. Nobody had meant to design it that way. It had simply grown over decades from 1,000 separate decisions that each made sense in isolation and together made a trap. No part of Europe felt the pressures of 1914 more acutely than the empire Franz Ferdinand was heir to, and no institution in European life was more poorly understood, then or now, than the Austro-Hungarian Empire itself. To an American eye, accustomed to the idea that nations are built around shared language and shared identity, Austria-Hungary requires explanation. It was not that kind of nation. It was something older and stranger, a dynastic empire held together not by nationalism, but by the opposite of nationalism, by the prestige and tradition of a single ruling family, the Habsburgs, whose name had been synonymous with European power for 4 centuries. The Habsburgs had, at various points in their history, ruled Spain, the Netherlands, large parts of Italy, and vast stretches of Central Europe. By 1914, their domain had contracted considerably, but it remained enormous. A landmass roughly the size of Texas and California combined, stretching from the Alps in the west to the plains of modern-day Romania in the east, from the industrial cities of Bohemia in the north to the Adriatic coast in the south. Within those borders lived 11 major nationalities. Germans and Hungarians held the dominant positions in government, military, and commerce, but the empire also contained Czechs, Poles, Croats, Serbs, Slovaks, Romanians, Italians, Slovenes, Ruthenians, and Bosnians, each with their own language, their own traditions, their own history, and their own ideas about who should be governing them and to what end. What held this together was not affection and not ideology. It was inertia, institutional habit, and the quiet authority of Emperor Franz Joseph, who had sat on the Habsburg throne since 1848 and who, by 1914, had been ruling longer than most of his subjects had been alive. Franz Joseph was 83 years old. He had outlasted almost everything: revolutions, lost wars, the assassination of his wife, Empress Elizabeth, on a Geneva pier in 1898, the suicide of his son and original heir Rudolf in a hunting lodge in 1889. He had become, through sheer duration, something close to a natural phenomenon, a fixture of European life so permanent that his subjects had largely stopped asking whether things might be arranged differently. His daily routine was famous for its severity. He rose before dawn, worked at his desk for hours, received ministers and officials with a punctuality that bordered on the compulsive, and it communicated, through its very rigidity, the sense that the empire was a thing of order and permanence. But beneath the surface of this apparent stability, the empire was fracturing along exactly the lines its structure had always made inevitable. The great organizing force of the late 19th century across Europe was nationalism, the idea that people sharing a common language and common culture deserved their own state, governed by themselves, expressing their own identity rather than someone else's. For most European nations, nationalism was a source of energy and pride. For Austria-Hungary, it was an existential threat. Every nationality within its borders that developed a strong national consciousness became, by definition, a potential argument for the empire's dissolution. A Czech who felt primarily Czech, a Croatian who felt primarily Croatian, a Serb who felt primarily Serbian, each was, in some fundamental sense, a person whose deepest loyalties lay somewhere other than Vienna. The empire's rulers were not unaware of this problem. They had tried various approaches to managing it: limited autonomy for some groups, political co-optation of nationalist leaders, the cultivation of regional identities that stopped short of full separatism. These strategies had achieved a kind of uneasy equilibrium. But equilibrium is not stability. It is the condition of competing pressures held momentarily in balance, and it requires constant tending. Nowhere was this more dangerous than in the South Slav question. The Slavic peoples of the Balkans, Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, Bosnians, shared deep cultural and linguistic ties, a common root that centuries of political division had not erased. And, just to Austria-Hungary's southeast, sat the Kingdom of Serbia, a small but intensely ambitious nation that had, over the preceding decades, developed a powerful nationalist vision of uniting all South Slavs under a single Serbian-led state. To Serbian nationalists, Austria-Hungary was not a legitimate governing power, but an occupying one, a foreign empire sitting on land and people that belonged, by right of blood and history, to a greater Serbian future. To Vienna, this vision was not liberation theology, but a direct threat to the empire's territorial integrity and, by extension, its survival. Bosnia was the sharpest edge of this conflict. Austria-Hungary had administered Bosnia since 1878, when the great powers of Europe had assigned it following the Russo-Turkish War, and had formally annexed the territory in 1908. The annexation infuriated Serbia, which had its own designs on Bosnia, and it infuriated Russia, which saw itself as the protector of Slavic peoples everywhere and resented Vienna's unilateral move without consultation. A crisis nearly erupted in 1908 that was diffused only when Russia, still recovering from its humiliating defeat in the Russo-Japanese War 3 years earlier, backed down. Russia did not forget the humiliation. Serbia did not abandon the vision. Bosnia remained a wound that neither side would allow to heal. This was the atmosphere into which Franz Ferdinand was arriving on the morning of June 28th. And the date itself carried its own weight that no one in Vienna appears to have weighed carefully enough. The 28th of June was Vidovdan, St. Vitus' Day, the most sacred date in the Serbian national calendar, the anniversary of the Battle of Kosovo in 1389, when a Serbian army had fallen to the Ottoman Turks in a defeat that Serbian culture had spent 5 centuries transforming into a myth of noble sacrifice, collective suffering, and eventual resurrection. To hold an imperial military parade on that date, in a city with a large Serbian population, was either an act of profound administrative carelessness or deliberate provocation. It was certainly a provocation, whether intended or not, and in politics, the perceived meaning of an action frequently matters more than the intention behind it. Franz Ferdinand himself remains one of the more complicated figures in this story, and one of the more genuinely tragic. He was not a man of easy temperament. He was formal, stubborn, quick to anger, impatient with the ceremonial demands of his position, and thoroughly disliked by the old aristocratic circles at the Viennese court, who found him brusque and his private life a source of embarrassment. He had not been born to be emperor. The original heir to the Habsburg throne had been his cousin Rudolf, Franz Joseph's only son, who died in the Meierling hunting lodge in 1889, in what was officially ruled a suicide, but which became, in the decades that followed, one of the great mysteries of European royal history. After Rudolf, the next in line was Franz Ferdinand's father, Archduke Karl Ludwig, who died in 1896 from typhoid fever contracted in a story that seems almost too emblematic of Habsburg fate, while drinking from the Jordan River on a religious pilgrimage to the Holy Land. This left Franz Ferdinand, a man who had spent his early adult life assuming he would hold no particular importance, suddenly the heir to one of the world's great empires. He was 31 years old when this fate was assigned to him. He spent the next 18 years preparing for a throne that would never actually be his. His marriage was perhaps the most revealing thing about him, and the most personally costly. In 1900, against the explicit opposition of Emperor Franz Joseph and the full weight of Habsburg dynastic protocol, Franz Ferdinand insisted on marrying Sophie Chotek, a Bohemian noblewoman of entirely respectable background but insufficiently grand lineage by Habsburg standards. The marriage was deemed morganatic, a legal designation meaning that it was recognized as valid, but that Sophie's lower status did not elevate itself to match her husband's. She could never hold the title of empress. Their children could never inherit the throne. At every formal court occasion, Sophie was required to take her place not beside her husband, but at the far end of the room, below the other archduchesses, in constant public acknowledgement of her station. When the imperial family appeared in the royal box at the opera, Sophie sat apart. Franz Ferdinand endured this with a cold, controlled fury that those who knew him described as one of the fixed points of his character. He loved Sophie with a constancy that the court found both admirable and inconvenient, and the humiliations visited on her appear to have deepened rather than resigned him. What made his death particularly sharp in retrospect was his politics. Franz Ferdinand was not, in the constellation of Austro-Hungarian power, a warmonger. He was something considerably rarer in the Vienna of 1914, a man who understood what a war would actually cost. The figure who most relentlessly pushed for military confrontation with Serbia was the chief of the General Staff, Franz Conrad von Hotzendorf, who had submitted formal proposals for a preventive war against Serbia no fewer than 25 times between 1906 and 1914 and had been refused each time. Franz Ferdinand was among those doing the refusing. He had grasped what Conrad had not, that a war with Serbia would draw in Russia, that a war with Russia would draw in Germany and France, and that the empire he was preparing to inherit could not survive a general European war regardless of which side won it. He wanted to reform the empire's internal structure, to give its Slavic peoples enough autonomy and recognition to diffuse the separatist pressure from within. He was one of the few men in the Austro-Hungarian establishment who could see clearly what was coming and who wanted to prevent it. And he was the one who was going to Sarajevo. The security arrangements for the visit were, by any later standard of analysis, shockingly inadequate. The route of the motorcade through the city had been published in the Sarajevo newspapers several days before the Archduke's arrival. There were no soldiers posted along the road. The police presence was drawn from the local force, which was small and under-equipped. Franz Ferdinand's personal security detail had not conducted any serious threat assessment of the city or its population before the visit. The prevailing assumption, shared by Governor Oskar Potiorek, who was responsible for the arrangements, was that Bosnia was pacified, that any residual resentment among the Serbian population was ambient rather than organized, and that a Sunday visit from the imperial heir was an occasion for pageantry rather than precaution. This assumption was not shared in Belgrade, where Serbian military intelligence had learned, through channels that remain partially obscure even now, that something was being planned against the Archduke in Sarajevo. Whether a specific warning reached Vienna before June 28th, and if so, what became of it, has been debated by historians for more than a century without resolution. What is certain is that no additional security measures were taken. In the weeks before the Archduke's arrival, A group of young Bosnian Serb nationalists had been making their way toward Sarajevo by different routes, crossing the border from Serbia into Bosnia through a network of sympathizers and safe houses maintained by Serbian nationalist organizations. They were carrying weapons, 4 revolvers and 6 hand grenades, obtained in Serbia with the knowledge, if not the explicit authorization, of a secret society known as the Black Hand. The Black Hand had been founded in 1911 by a group of Serbian military officers, most prominently a colonel named Dragutin Dimitrijević, who went by the code name Apis. Its stated purpose was the unification of all South Slavic peoples by any means necessary, and its methods extended well beyond the parliamentary petitions and newspaper editorials that characterized more conventional nationalist politics. The organization's relationship with the Serbian government was complex and intentionally opaque. The Serbian Prime Minister, Nikola Pasic, almost certainly knew something of what was being planned. His government almost certainly did not formally authorize it. In the murky space between official knowledge and official complicity, the conspirators crossed into Bosnia with their weapons. The young men who arrived in Sarajevo were not seasoned operatives. Most of them were teenagers or barely past their teens, burning with the particular intensity of those who have found, in a political cause, a container large enough to hold all their frustration, idealism, and hunger for meaning. Their nominal leader was a 19-year-old named Gavrilo Princip, a Bosnian Serb of slight build, poor health, and fierce convictions who had twice failed the entrance examination for the Serbian military. He had read revolutionary pamphlets and the biographies of political assassins. He believed, with the absolute certainty available only to the very young, that individual acts of violence could awaken nations from their passivity and accelerate the march of history. He had volunteered for this mission and been accepted largely because no one better had stepped forward. There were 7 conspirators in total, positioned at various points along the Appel Quay, the main boulevard running alongside the Miljacka River through which the imperial motorcade would pass on its way to the city hall. Most of them had spent the previous night unable to sleep. Several of them, by their own later accounts, had not entirely resolved the question of whether they would actually act when the moment came. History is frequently made by people who are not quite ready. The morning of June 28th began at the train station, where Franz Ferdinand and Sophie arrived from the resort town of Ilidza, where they had been staying during the military maneuvers. Sophie wore a white dress with a wide-brimmed hat adorned with feathers. Franz Ferdinand was in his military uniform, a dark blue tunic decorated with medals and orders, a helmet with green feathers. They were greeted by local officials and loaded into a motorcade of 6 open automobiles for the drive through the city. The Archduke and his wife rode in the second car, a large open Graf-and-Stift touring car, together with Governor Potiorek and Count Franz von Harrach, who had offered his car for the occasion and would later describe placing himself on the running board on the left side of the vehicle, facing outward, under the impression that any threat would come from the crowd on the left. The threat came from the right. At approximately 10:10 in the morning, as the motorcade moved along the Appel Quay past the dense crowd of Sunday onlookers, one of the conspirators, a 20-year-old named Nedeljko Kabrinović, stepped to the edge of the crowd. He struck the detonator cap of his grenade against a lamppost to arm it, waited the required 2 seconds, and threw it directly at the Archduke's car. What followed was a second of confusion, then the sound of the detonator, then a flat, hard explosion. Franz Ferdinand, in a moment that those present afterward found difficult to categorize as either courage or simple reflex, raised his arm and deflected the grenade. It bounced off the folded-back canvas roof of the car and clattered onto the street, where it exploded beneath the following vehicle, wounding several members of the Archduke's staff and a number of civilians standing nearby. Kabrinovic, his mission failed, immediately swallowed the cyanide capsule he had been given for exactly this contingency and leapt from the bridge railing into the Miljacka River. The cyanide was old and had lost most of its potency. The river, in the dry weeks of a Bosnian June, was approximately 4 inches deep. Kabrinovic was dragged, vomiting and barely unconscious, from the riverbed and arrested by police. The motorcade accelerated and proceeded toward the city hall. The ceremony at the city hall unfolded with a quality of unreality that participants later struggled to describe. The mayor of Sarajevo, Fehim Efendi Kurcik, delivered his prepared welcoming address without alteration, as though an assassination attempt had not occurred 15 minutes earlier. Franz Ferdinand interrupted him with barely concealed fury. They had come to Sarajevo on a friendly visit, he said, and had been greeted by bombs. How did the mayor account for this with his prepared welcome speech? He was then persuaded by those around him to allow the ceremony to continue. The speech continued, there were formal responses, there were photographs. The machinery of official procedure ground forward because no one had written instructions for what to do differently, and because in the presence of royalty, the instinct of officials is always catastrophically to proceed. After the ceremony, there was a brief discussion of the changed circumstances. Franz Ferdinand expressed his wish to go to the hospital to visit the members of his entourage who had been wounded. Governor Potiorek agreed that the route should be altered. Rather than driving through the city center as originally planned, the motorcade would proceed straight along the Appel Quay, keeping to the open road along the river. This instruction was communicated to the lead driver. It was not communicated, in the subsequent confusion of departure, to the drivers of the cars behind him. Small failures accumulate. That is how catastrophes are made. The motorcade pulled away from City Hall at approximately 10:45. The lead car turned right onto Franz Josef Street, the originally planned route into the city center. The second car, carrying Franz Ferdinand and Sophie and operating on the instruction it had never received, followed automatically. Governor Potiorek, realizing the mistake, called out to the driver to stop and reverse. The driver, a man named Leopold Lojka, braked. The car came to a halt, by a coincidence so extreme that it has the quality of dark farce or divine arrangement, depending on one's disposition about such things, directly in front of Schiller's Delicatessen, on the corner of Franz Josef Street and the Appel Quay. Gavrilo Princip was standing on the pavement in front of that delicatessen. He had been there for some time. After the failure of the grenade attack and the dispersal of the motorcade, Princip had concluded the mission was over. He had drifted, in the purposeless way of someone whose plan has dissolved, to the corner where Schiller's stood, perhaps to collect himself, perhaps simply because it was close to the river and he did not know where else to go. He had a revolver in his coat. He looked up and found himself at a distance of approximately 5 feet, looking at the open car containing the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire and his wife. He drew the revolver. He stepped forward. He fired twice. The first bullet entered Franz Ferdinand's neck, severing the jugular vein. The second struck Sophie in the abdomen. For a moment, neither of them appeared to understand what had happened. Franz Ferdinand remained upright in his seat, his expression unchanged. When Count von Harrach, standing on the running board, leaned toward him and asked if he was wounded, the Archduke's response was repeated several times in a voice that those present described as almost normal. "Es ist nichts." "It is nothing." Then Sophie slumped forward. Franz Ferdinand turned to her. His voice, by all accounts, changed. He said her name, Soferl, the diminutive, the private name, not the formal address. And then the words that have been repeated in every account of that morning, because they contain, in the briefest possible space, the entire human cost of what had just occurred. Sterbe nicht, bleibe am Leben für unsere Kinder. Do not die, stay alive for our children. She was already beyond hearing him. Count von Harrach, watching from inches away, later wrote that as he held Franz Ferdinand's head to keep him upright, he noticed that the Archduke's mouth was filling with blood, and that with each breath a thin stream of it issued from the corner of his lips. Franz Ferdinand's last words, by Harrach's account, were a repetition of Sophie's name, growing quieter with each breath, until there were no more. Sophie died in the car. Franz Ferdinand died shortly afterward at the governor's residence, still sitting upright, the medals on his chest catching the midday light, his body refusing even then to acknowledge what had been done to it. Gavrilo Princip was seized by the crowd before he could use his own cyanide capsule and beaten severely before the police could extract him. He was 19 years old. He would die in an Austrian prison 4 years later of tuberculosis at 23, having spent his entire adult life as a prisoner, having set in motion events that killed 17 million people, and having understood by the end very little of what he had done. In the streets of Sarajevo, in the minutes after the shots, there was a strange silence. People stood and looked at one another. Officials sent telegrams. The police began their work. Governor Potiorek, by multiple accounts, stood in the street without speaking for a long time. Across Europe, in the hours and days that followed, most people received the news with sorrow and expressed the reasonable, understandable, and entirely wrong belief that the situation would be managed. There had been crises before. There had been assassinations before, just 14 years earlier. An American president, William McKinley, had been shot, and the world had not gone to war over it. Diplomacy existed for exactly these moments. The machinery of international relations would do what it was designed to do. They were not wrong that it could have been managed. They were wrong that it would be. The machine was already running. The alliances were already drawn. The mobilization plans already written, filed in general staff offices from Berlin to St. Petersburg, waiting for the precise conditions that would require their execution. What had looked, from the outside, like a stable and rational system was in fact a compressed spring, and on a Sunday morning in a Balkan city, someone had released the catch. The old world did not yet know it was over. That knowledge was 5 weeks away. The news reached Vienna on a Sunday afternoon in the particular way that catastrophic news always travels. First as rumor, then as telegram, then as the specific silence that falls over official buildings when the people inside them understand that the ordinary business of governance has been suspended by something larger than governance. Emperor Franz Joseph was at his summer residence at Bad Ischl, a mountain spa town in the Austrian Alps, where he had spent his summers for decades, when a courier arrived with the telegram informing him that his nephew and heir had been shot dead in Sarajevo alongside his wife. Franz Joseph was 83 years old. He had already outlived a wife, a son, and a brother. He read the telegram, set it down, and is reported to have said only that he had been spared nothing. He then, because this was the kind of man he was, returned to his desk and continued his work. In Vienna itself, the initial public response was muted in ways that surprised observers who had expected grief or outrage. Franz Ferdinand had not been a popular figure. The court had never embraced him. The Viennese public, which had watched him navigate 18 years of official slights and dynastic maneuvering with visible ill temper, mourned him with a respect that stopped noticeably short of love. Some diplomatic observers noted that the mood in the Austrian capital in the first days after the assassination was less grief than calculation. The question being asked in the offices of the Foreign Ministry and the War Ministry was not primarily how to mourn the Archduke. It was how to use him. This is the moment where the story of a murder becomes the story of a war. And the transformation is not accidental. It requires decision. It requires men in rooms making choices that they could, at each stage, have made differently. The assassination of Franz Ferdinand did not make the First World War inevitable. What made it inevitable was a sequence of decisions taken over the following 5 weeks by governments that had convinced themselves they were managing a crisis when they were, in fact, constructing one. The key figure in Vienna in those first days was not the emperor, whose age and temperament made him a ratifier of decisions rather than a maker of them. It was the foreign minister, Count Leopold von Berchtold, a wealthy aristocrat of considerable social grace and somewhat less considerable strategic vision, who had spent his tenure at the foreign ministry attempting to navigate the empire's deteriorating position in the Balkans without committing fully to any policy firm enough to be either effective or obviously wrong. The assassination gave him and those around him something they had wanted for years: a pretext. The word pretext requires some unpacking because it implies a cynicism that the men in Vienna would have rejected as unfair to their genuine concerns. Austria-Hungary's anxiety about Serbian nationalism was real. The threat posed to the empire's territorial integrity by the idea of a greater South Slav state was real. Serbian nationalist organizations had been operating inside the empire's borders for years, cultivating sympathizers, distributing propaganda, and in some cases facilitating exactly the kind of violence that had now killed the heir to the throne. The Austro-Hungarian government's desire to confront Serbia and reduce its capacity for mischief was not invented. It was a legitimate strategic interest, held sincerely by serious men. What turned a legitimate strategic interest into a catastrophe was the decision, made within days of the assassination, before any serious investigation had been conducted, that the response to Sarajevo would not be diplomatic pressure or legal proceedings or even a limited military demonstration, but a deliberately constructed ultimatum designed from the beginning not to succeed. Designed, in other words, not to resolve the crisis, but to begin a war. The man most responsible for this decision was not Berchtold, but the chief of the General Staff, Franz Conrad von Hotzendorf. Conrad was the most insistent voice for war in the Austro-Hungarian establishment, a man who had spent years arguing that Serbia's growing ambition could only be checked by force and who had watched with mounting impatience as politician after politician found reasons to delay. Now, with the Archduke dead and the public outraged, he moved quickly to ensure that the response would be the one he had always wanted. What neither Conrad nor Berchtold could do alone, however, was act. Because acting against Serbia meant risking war with Russia, and risking war with Russia meant risking war with France, and risking war with France meant, almost certainly, war with Britain as well. Austria-Hungary could not fight that war alone. It needed to know, before it moved, whether Germany would stand with it. The answer it received would be the most consequential single communication of the summer of 1914. Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany was at the Kiel Regatta, an annual yachting competition on the Baltic coast, when he received the news from Sarajevo. His initial reaction was genuine shock, and what appears in his private correspondence to have been genuine sorrow. He had known Franz Ferdinand personally and had liked him in the competitive, slightly wary way of men who recognize similar qualities in each other. He returned to Berlin immediately. What happened in the days between Wilhelm's return and his fateful response to Vienna reveals something important about how great powers make catastrophic decisions. It was not the product of a single reckless choice by a single reckless man, though Wilhelm's personality made him prone to recklessness. It was the product of a system in which the logic of alliance, the culture of the military staff, and the particular vanities of the men involved all pointed in the same direction, and in which the voices that might have counseled caution were either absent, ignored, or had already been so thoroughly marginalized that they could not make themselves heard. On July 5, 1914, 1 week after the assassination, the Austrian ambassador to Germany, Count Soggeni, met with Kaiser Wilhelm at the new palace in Potsdam. He presented Wilhelm with a personal letter from Franz Joseph asking for Germany's support in whatever action Austria-Hungary chose to take against Serbia. Wilhelm read it, consulted briefly with his Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg, and told the ambassador that Austria-Hungary could count on Germany's full support. Full support. Unconditional, whatever Austria chose to do. This commitment, made in an afternoon, without a full meeting of the German government, without a serious assessment of the military or diplomatic consequences, and on the basis of almost no information about what Austria actually intended to do, has since become known as the blank check. It is the right name for it. Wilhelm handed Austria-Hungary a signed authorization and left the amount to be filled in later. He appears to have believed, or told himself, that the crisis would be a local one, that Russia would back down as it had in 1908, that whatever Austria did could be contained. He returned to his vacation cruise. He was wrong about all of it, and the blank check transformed a regional crisis into a continental one the moment it was issued, because it removed the one constraint that might have forced Vienna toward a negotiated solution. The knowledge that Germany would not follow it into a war it had chosen to start. Armed with German backing, the Austro-Hungarian government spent the next 2 weeks constructing what would become one of the most deliberately provocative diplomatic documents in modern history. The ultimatum to Serbia, finalized on July 23rd, contained 10 demands covering everything from the suppression of anti-Austrian propaganda to the participation of Austro-Hungarian officials in the Serbian government's own investigation of the assassination. Several of the demands, most observers agreed at the time and historians have agreed since, were framed specifically to make acceptance impossible. They were not designed to produce compliance. They were designed to produce rejection, which would then provide the justification for military action that Vienna had already decided to take. When the ultimatum was delivered to the Serbian government on the evening of July 23rd, the foreign ministers of Europe who read it were uniformly alarmed. The British Foreign Secretary, Sir Edward Grey, a careful and experienced diplomat who had spent years threading his way through European crises, described it as the most formidable document he had ever seen, one state addressed to another that was still formally at peace. Even the German Foreign Office, which had known the ultimatum was coming, expressed private surprise at its severity. The Serbian government had 48 hours to respond. What happened next confounded almost everyone's expectations, including Vienna's. Serbia, a small nation of roughly 4.5 million people facing the ultimatum of a great empire that had just received the unconditional backing of the most powerful military force on the continent, accepted nearly all of it. Point by point, in language that walked to the very edge of national humiliation, the Serbian reply accepted 8 of the 10 demands outright and offered conditional acceptance or negotiation on the remaining 2. When Kaiser Wilhelm read the Serbian response, he wrote in the margin of the document that it was a great moral victory for Vienna and that every cause for war had been removed. He was, for once in his erratic life, exactly right. Serbia had done what small nations do when they have no other choice. It had given away almost everything in order to survive. A government acting in good faith, seeking a genuine resolution to a genuine grievance, would have taken yes for an answer. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia on July 28, 1914, exactly 1 month after the assassination, before the Serbian response had even been properly reviewed by the relevant officials in Vienna. The declaration was communicated in a detail that captures the modernity and the absurdity of the moment simultaneously by telegram. The machine began to turn. What happened in the days following Austria's declaration of war is a story about the difference between the pace at which human beings can think and the pace at which the systems they build can move. The alliance system had been constructed on military logic, and military logic in 1914 was dominated by a single overwhelming fact. The army that mobilized first had an enormous advantage, and any delay in mobilization, once a crisis reached a certain threshold, could be fatal. Russia was the first of the great powers to face this pressure directly. Russia regarded itself as the protector of Slavic peoples in general and of Serbia in particular, and Austria's declaration of war against Serbia was an event that the Tsar's government could not ignore without catastrophic loss of prestige. Tsar Nicholas II, a gentle and fundamentally decent man who was thoroughly unsuited to the position he had inherited, ordered a partial mobilization of Russian forces in the southern military districts facing Austria-Hungary on July 25th, before the declaration of war as a warning signal. The problem with partial mobilization, as the Russian military staff immediately explained to the Tsar, was that it did not actually exist as an operational concept in any of the plans they had prepared. Russian war planning was premised on a general European war against both Austria-Hungary and Germany simultaneously, because the alliance system made that the only realistic scenario. The plans for a partial mobilization against Austria alone had not been properly developed, and beginning a partial mobilization and then attempting to expand it to a general one would create exactly the kind of organizational chaos that could leave Russian forces immobile and unprepared at the moment they were most needed. The generals told the Tsar that he had to choose, mobilize fully or not at all. This is the moment where the difference between a diplomatic system and a military system becomes visible and fatal. A diplomat in the same position would have said, "Hold the partial measure as a signal, wait to see how Vienna responds, keep options open." The military staff said, "You cannot hold a partial measure because the partial measure, as you have described it, does not exist in our operational plans. You must decide." Nicholas wavered for days, exchanging a series of telegrams with Kaiser Wilhelm in which the two cousins, who had known each other since childhood and addressed each other as Nicky and Willie, pleaded with each other to stop the machinery that neither of them, it turned out, fully controlled. Nicky asked Willie to restrain Austria. Willie asked Nicky to halt the mobilization. Both continued to order the actions they were simultaneously asking each other to prevent. The telegrams have a quality of tragedy that even a century of hindsight cannot diminish. Two men who did not want a war, who knew each other, who were asking each other sincerely to find a way out, and who found that the institutions they nominally commanded had already acquired a momentum that made their personal wishes largely irrelevant. On July 30th, under pressure from his generals, and in the belief that Germany would move against Russia regardless, Nicholas ordered full general mobilization. Germany's response to Russian general mobilization was not a decision in any meaningful sense of the word. It was the automatic execution of a plan that had been written years earlier and that the German military staff had spent those years insisting could not be modified without destroying its effectiveness entirely. The plan was called the Schlieffen Plan, named for the former chief of the German General Staff, Alfred von Schlieffen, who had developed it in the early years of the 20th century and refined it until his retirement in 1906. Its premise was the problem Bismarck had always feared, and Schlieffen had decided to solve militarily since it had not been solved diplomatically. Germany faced potential war on two fronts simultaneously against France in the west and Russia in the east. Schlieffen's solution was elegantly simple in concept and staggeringly complex in execution. Germany could not fight both wars at once. Therefore, it would fight them sequentially. The plan called for the bulk of German forces to be thrown westward immediately, delivering a rapid and decisive defeat to France within approximately 6 weeks, before Russia, with its vast size and poor railway infrastructure, could fully mobilize. Once France was knocked out, the full weight of German forces could be redirected east to deal with Russia at leisure. The critical feature of the plan, the one that made it both militarily rational and diplomatically catastrophic, was the route it required German forces to take into France. A direct assault on the Franco-German border would run into the heavily fortified French defensive line that had been built specifically to resist a German invasion. Schlieffen's solution was to go around it, a massive sweep through neutral Belgium, curling down from the north to encircle Paris from the west. It was a bold plan that depended entirely on speed, and speed depended entirely on the railways moving troops on an unalterable timetable that could not be adjusted once set in motion. The plan had been refined and rehearsed for years, and the German military staff had spent those years insisting, with the particular stubbornness of men whose professional identity was invested in a single document, that any deviation from it would be catastrophic. When Kaiser Wilhelm, in a brief moment of alarm in late July, asked his chief of staff, Helmuth von Moltke, whether German forces could be redirected eastward only, fighting Russia but not France, Moltke told him it was impossible. The railways had been scheduled, the men had been assigned, the logistics had been planned to the hour. To change it now would produce not an army but a chaos of men and trains and supply lines with no coherent direction. Moltke was so distressed by even being asked the question that he later described the moment as one of the worst of his life. Wilhelm backed down. Military plans, once sufficiently detailed and sufficiently rehearsed, become a kind of institutional gravity. They pull events toward them. The critical feature of the Schlieffen route, the one that transformed a European war into a world war, was that it required Germany to march through Belgium. Belgium's neutrality had been guaranteed by international treaty in 1839, signed and solemnly affirmed by all the great powers of Europe, including Germany. Britain had been the most insistent guarantor of that neutrality, not out of particular affection for Belgium, but out of the long-standing British strategic principle that no single great power should be permitted to dominate the ports and coastline of the Low Countries, which sat directly across the Channel from the English coast. The Schlieffen Plan required Germany to violate both the treaty and that principle simultaneously. Until Germany marched into Belgium, Britain's entry into the war was not certain. There was a substantial faction in the British cabinet that opposed involvement in what it characterized as a continental quarrel. The invasion of Belgium resolved that argument instantly and completely. It gave the British government a legal obligation, a strategic necessity, and a moral cause simultaneously, and it handed the Liberal government of Herbert Asquith the ability to bring an uncertain public into a war on terms that felt, to that public, not like imperial calculation, but like the defense of a small nation against a bully. German Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg, when the British ambassador confronted him with the implications of violating Belgian neutrality, reportedly dismissed the 1839 treaty as a scrap of paper. The phrase, reported in the British press within days, outraged British public opinion in a way that no strategic argument could have matched, and it handed the government precisely the public mandate it needed. Bethmann later reflected in his memoirs that the comment had been a catastrophic error. It was. But the deeper error was the plan that made the comment necessary, and the deeper error still was the system that had produced a plan from which no deviation was considered possible. On August 1st, Germany declared war on Russia. On August 3rd, Germany declared war on France. On August 4th, German forces crossed into Belgium, and Britain declared war on Germany. In the space of 5 weeks, a murder in a medium-sized Balkan city had become a world war. The question that occupied those who lived through it, and has occupied historians ever since, is whether any of this was inevitable, and at what point the last exit was passed. It is a question worth sitting with, because the answer determines not just how we understand 1914, but how we understand the relationship between human agency and the systems human beings construct to organize their affairs. There were moments throughout those 5 weeks when a different decision could have changed the outcome. If Vienna had treated the Serbian response as the capitulation it largely was, if Germany had made its support for Austria conditional rather than blank, if Russia had accepted the risk of delayed mobilization in exchange for more time for diplomacy, if the German military had developed an alternative to the Schlieffen Plan that did not require the immediate violation of Belgian neutrality, if any of the men in any of those rooms had chosen at any of those moments differently. The exits existed. They were not taken. Why not is the question that should trouble us most, because the men who did not take them were not, in the main, lunatics or monsters. They were, by the standards of their time, sophisticated, educated, and reasonably intelligent people who had spent their careers managing the affairs of great nations. Several of them, in private correspondence, expressed serious doubts about the course they were following even as they followed it. Bethmann Hollweg wrote to a friend in late July that Germany was leaping into the dark and that the outcome might be devastating for everyone involved. He authorized the blank check anyway. Conrad had spent years warning that war with Serbia would be catastrophic for the empire. He pushed for it anyway. The Tsar did not want a general war. He ordered general mobilization anyway. What defeated them was not stupidity, but a combination of factors that together proved stronger than any individual's capacity for resistance. The alliance system had created a logic of automatic response that made unilateral restraint feel, to each government individually, like unilateral disarmament. The mobilization timetables had transferred the decisive moment of the crisis from the politicians to the generals, and the generals had spent their careers preparing for war rather than preventing it. The culture of the European great powers in 1914 had not yet absorbed the possibility that a general war would be as catastrophic as it turned out to be. The last major European conflict, the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, had lasted only months, and most military planners expected this one to be over before Christmas. There was also something else at work, something harder to name, but no less real: a failure of imagination. The men making these decisions had no model for what a modern industrial war between great powers would actually look like. They had read the accounts of previous wars. They had studied battles and campaigns, but they had not conceived, could not conceive, what it would mean to put the full productive capacity of industrial civilization in the service of killing. The machine gun, the artillery shell produced in factories running day and night, The poison gas, the trenches stretching from the English Channel to the Swiss border, none of this existed in their calculations because it had never existed before. They were planning for the war they knew. They got the war that industrialization had made possible, and it was a different thing entirely. It lasted 4 years. It killed 17 million people. It destroyed 4 empires, including the Austro-Hungarian Empire, whose defense had been the original justification for everything. Nations that make decisions on the assumption that the worst will be brief tend to be especially undone when the worst turns out to be very long. There is a moment, amid the cascade of mobilization orders and ultimata and declarations, that demands to be recorded because it contains, compressed into a single exchange, the full human dimension of what was being lost. On the evening of August 3rd, the British Foreign Secretary, Sir Edward Grey, stood at the window of his office in the Foreign Office in London and watched the lamplighters making their rounds in St. James's Park below. A friend was with him. Grey turned from the window and said, "The lamps are going out all over Europe. We shall not see them lit again in our lifetime." He was right about that, too. Grey was not a sentimental man. He was a practical, cautious, experienced diplomat who had spent a decade trying to manage Britain's place in an increasingly dangerous European order. The remark was not poetry for its own sake. It was an accurate assessment of what a general European war would do to the civilization that had built those lampposts and those parks and the whole gleaming, interconnected, mutually dependent world that so many people had convinced themselves was too rational to destroy. The world they were destroying was not only a political order, it was a set of assumptions that progress was continuous, that civilization advanced, that the worst was always behind rather than ahead, that the institutions men had built to manage their conflicts were adequate to the conflicts they faced. Those assumptions did not survive 1914. The 20th century, in many of its most catastrophic aspects, is the story of people living in the rubble of those assumptions and trying to build something in their place. Gavrilo Princip, when he was tried by the Austro-Hungarian authorities in October 1914, was asked if he understood what his actions had caused. He was 20 years old. He was sitting in a courtroom in a city that was already at war, in an empire already spending lives at a rate no one had imagined possible in June. He said that he had not intended to cause a world war, that he had acted for the liberation of his people, and that he was sorry for the deaths of the children he had left fatherless. He did not say he was sorry for the assassination. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison, the maximum sentence Austrian law permitted for a convicted murderer who had committed his crime before the age of 20. He served his sentence in the fortress of Theresienstadt, in conditions of deliberate harshness, shackled and kept in semi-darkness for extended periods. He contracted tuberculosis. He died there on April 28, 1918, at the age of 23, weighing 88 pounds. The empire he had helped destroy outlasted him by only 7 months. The First World War ended in November 1918 with the collapse of 4 empires: the German, the Austro-Hungarian, the Russian, and the Ottoman. The map of Europe was redrawn at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919 in ways that created new nations, extinguished old ones, and planted the seeds of the next catastrophe with a thoroughness that, in retrospect, seems almost methodical. The punitive terms imposed on Germany at Versailles generated the resentments that would bring Adolf Hitler to power 14 years later. The dissolution of Austria-Hungary created a cluster of small, economically fragile, ethnically mixed states in Central Europe that would become, in the 1930s, the contested ground of the next great crisis. The Ottoman Empire's dissolution set in motion conflicts in the Middle East, whose consequences are still unresolved. 100 years of relative peace, the century that had produced the most spectacular flowering of European civilization in the continent's history, was followed by a century that managed, in its first 50 years, to produce 2 world wars, the Holocaust, and the invention of weapons capable of ending human civilization entirely. The shot that broke the world broke more than contemporaries understood, and what it broke has never been entirely repaired. It is worth returning at the end to the streets of Sarajevo on that June morning, to the open car and the 2 people in it, to understand what is actually being said when we say that a single assassination started a world war. Franz Ferdinand and Sophie had not wanted to make the trip. The visit had been organized by others, for reasons of imperial symbolism. They had complied because the role demanded compliance. They had ridden through the decorated streets of a city whose population viewed them with at best indifference, and at worst hatred, in an open car with no meaningful security, on the most sensitive date in the Serbian nationalist calendar, and they had survived a grenade attack, and then gotten back into the car to go visit the people who had been wounded. There is something in that detail, in the return to the car after the grenade, that seems characteristically Franz Ferdinand. Stubborn, dutiful, incapable of retreating. He was not a good man in the way that saints are good. He was difficult, impatient, and capable of considerable coldness. But he was not the cause of the war that his death produced. He was, if anything, one of the few serious obstacles to it. And in the deep irony of the morning of June 28th, he was also, through no fault of his own, the instrument of it. The world he died in believed itself stable. It believed that the institutions men had spent a century constructing had made the worst kind of war impossible. It believed that the telegraph and the railway and the economic interdependence of nations had bound the great powers together in interests too intertwined to sacrifice to military adventure. It believed, in short, that civilization had progressed beyond the capacity for its own destruction. June 28, 1914, was the day that belief died. What replaced it would take a century to understand, and we are still in the understanding of it. The lesson of the 5 weeks between the Archduke's death and the mobilization of every great power in Europe is not that war is inevitable, nor that diplomacy is useless, nor that individual decisions do not matter. The lesson is more specific and more unsettling than any of those, that systems built to provide security can, under certain conditions, provide the opposite, and that the moment a system becomes too complex and too fast for the people nominally running it to control, the system itself becomes the most dangerous actor in the room. The lamps went out in the summer of 1914, and 17 million people died in the darkness before they came back on. They have not always stayed on since.